Section 31 of the works of Edgar Allan Poe, RavenEdition Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Samantha Gubitz. The works of Edgar Allan Poe, RavenEdition Volume 3 by Edgar Allan Poe. Section 31. King Pest. A tale containing an allegory. The gods do bear, and will allow in kings, the things which they abhor in rascal roots. Brockhurst's Tragedy of Ferrex and Porrex. About 12 o'clock one night in the month of October, and during the chivalrous reign of the third Edward, two seamen belonging to the crew of the Free and Easy, a trading schooner plying between Sluys and the Thames, and then at anchor in that river, were much astonished to find themselves seated in the tap-room of an alehouse in the parish of St. Andrew's, London, which alehouse bore for sign the portraiture of a jolly tar. The room, although ill-contrived, smoke-blackened, low-pitched, and in every other respect agreeing with the general character of such places at that period, was nevertheless, in the opinion of the grotesque groups scattered here and there within it, sufficiently well adapted to its purpose. Of these groups, our two seamen formed, I think, the most interesting, if not the most conspicuous. The one, who appeared to be the elder, and whom his companion addressed by the characteristic appellation of Legs, was at the same time much the taller of the two. He might have measured 6 feet and a half, and an habitual stoop in the shoulders seemed to have been the necessary consequence of an altitude so enormous. Superfluities in height were, however, more than accounted for by deficiencies in other respects. He was exceedingly thin, and might, as his associates asserted, have answered, when drunk, for a pennant at the masthead, or, when sober, have served for a jib-boom. But these jests, and others of a similar nature, had evidently produced at no time any effect upon the contonatory muscles of the tar. With high cheekbones, a large hawk nose, retreating chin, fallen underjaw, and huge protruding white eyes, the expression of his countenance, although tinged with a species of dogged indifference to matters and things in general, was not the less utterly solemn and serious beyond all attempts at imitation or description. The younger seaman was, in all outward appearance, the converse of his companion. His stature could not have exceeded 4 feet. A pair of stumpy bow-legs supported his squat, unwieldy figure, while his unusually short and thick arms, with no ordinary fists at their extremities, swung off dangling from his sides like the fins of a sea-turtle. Small eyes, of no particular color, twinkled far back in his head. His nose remained buried in the mass of flesh which enveloped his round, full, and purple face, and his thick upper lip rested upon the still thicker one beneath with an air of complacent self-satisfaction, much heightened by the owner's habit of licking them at intervals. He evidently regarded his tall shipmate with a feeling half wondrous, half quizzical, and stared up occasionally in his face as the red setting sun stares up at the crags of Ben Nevis. Various and eventful, however, had been the peregrination of the worthy couple in and about the different tap-houses of the neighborhood during the early hours of the night. Funds, even the most ample, are not always everlasting, and it was with empty pockets our friends had ventured upon the present hostelry. At the precise period, then, when this history properly commences, Legs and his fellow Hugh Tarpaulin sat each with both elbows resting upon the large oaken table in the middle of the floor, and with a hand upon either cheek. They were eyeing, from behind a huge flagon of unpaid-for humming stuff, the portentous words "No Chalk," which, to their indignation and astonishment, were scored over the doorway by means of that very mineral whose presence they purported to deny. Not that gifts of deciphering written characters, a gift among the commonalty of that day considered little less cabalistical than the art of inditing, could, in strict justice, have been laid to the charge of either disciple of the sea, But there was, to say the truth, a certain twist in the formation of the letters, an indescribable lee-lurch about the whole, which foreboded, in the opinion of both seamen, a long run of dirty weather, and determined them at once, in the allegorical words of Legges himself, to pump ship, clew up all sail, and scud before the wind. Having accordingly disposed of what remained of the ale, and looped up the points of their short doublets, they finally made a bolt for the street. Although Tarpaulin rolled twice into the fireplace, mistaking it for the door, yet their escape was at length happily effected, and half after 12 o'clock found our heroes ripe for mischief, and running for life down a dark alley in the direction of St. Andrew's Stair, hotly pursued by the landlady of the Jolly Tar. At the epoch of this eventful tale, and periodically for many years before and after, all England, but more especially the metropolis, resounded with the fearful cry of plague. The city was in a great measure depopulated, and in those horrible regions, in the vicinity of the Thames, where amid the dark, narrow, and filthy lanes and alleys, the demon of disease was supposed to have had his nativity, all terror and superstition were alone to be found stalking abroad. By authority of the king, such districts were placed under ban, and all persons forbidden, under pain of death, to intrude upon their dismal solitude. Yet neither the mandate of the monarch, nor the huge barriers erected at the entrances of the streets, nor the prospect of that loathsome death, which, with almost absolute certainty, overwhelmed the wretch, whom no peril could deter from the adventure, prevented the unfurnished and untenanted dwellings from being stripped, by the hand of nightly rapine, of every article, such as iron, brass, or lead-work, which could in any manner be turned to a profitable account. Above all, it was usually found, upon the annual winter opening of the barriers, that locks, bolts, and secret cellars had proved but slender protection to those rich stores of wines and liquors which, in consideration of the risk and trouble of removal, many of the numerous dealers having shops in the neighborhood had consented to trust, during the period of exile, to so insufficient a security. But there were very few of the terror-stricken people who attributed these doings to the agency of human hands. Pest spirits, plague goblins, and fever demons were the popular imps of mischief, and tales so blood-chilling were hourly told that the whole mass of forbidden buildings was at length enveloped in terror as in a shroud, and the plunderer himself was often scared away by the horrors of his own depreciation had created, leaving the entire vast circuit of prohibited district to gloom, silence, pestilence, and death. It was by one of the terrific barriers already mentioned, and which indicated the region beyond to be under the pest ban, that in scrambling down an alley, Legges and the worthy Hugh Tarpaulin found their progress suddenly impeded. To return was out of the question, and no time was to be lost, as their pursuers were closing upon their heels. With thoroughbred seamen, to clamber up the roughly fashioned plank-work was a trifle, and, maddened with the twofold excitement of exercise and liquor, they leaped unhesitatingly down with the enclosure, and, holding on their drunken course with shouts and yellings, were soon bewildered in its noisome and intricate recesses. Had they not, indeed, been intoxicated beyond moral sense, their reeling footsteps must have been palsied by the horrors of their situation. The air was cold and misty. The paving stones, loosened from their beds, lay in wild disorder among the tall, rank grass, which sprang up around the feet and ankles. Fallen houses choked up the streets. Most fetid and poisonous smells everywhere prevailed, and by the aid of that ghastly light, which, even at midnight, never fails to emanate from a vapory and pestilential atmosphere, might be discerned, lying in the bypaths and alleys, or rotting in the windowless habitations, the carcass of many a nocturnal plunderer arrested by the hand of the plague in the very perpetration of his robbery. But it lay not in the power of images, or sensations, or impediments such as these, to stay the course of men who, naturally brave, and at that time especially brimful of courage and of humming stuff, would have reeled, as straight as their condition might have permitted, undauntedly into the very jaws of death. Onward, still onward, stalked the grim legs, making the desolate solemnity echo and re-echo with yells like the terrific war-whoop of the Indian. And onward, still onward, rolled the dumpy tarpaulin, hanging on to the doublet of his more active companion, and far surpassing the latter's most strenuous exertions in the way of vocal music by bull-roarings in basso from the profundity of his stentorian lungs. They had now evidently reached the stronghold of the pestilence. Their way, at every step or plunge, grew more noisome and more horrible, the paths more narrow and more intricate. Huge stones and beams, falling momently from the decaying roofs above them, gave evidence, by their sullen and heavy descent, of the vast height of the surrounding houses, and while actual exertion became necessary to force a passage through frequent heaps of rubbish, it was by no means seldom that the hand fell upon a skeleton, or rested upon a more fleshly corpse. Suddenly, as the seamen stumbled against the entrance of a tall and ghastly-looking building, a yell more than usually shrill from the throat of the excited legs was replied to from within, in a rapid succession of wild, laughter-like and fiendish shrieks. Nothing daunted at sounds which of such a nature, at such a time, and in such a place, might have curdled the very blood in hearts less irrevocably on fire. The drunken couple rushed headlong against the door, burst it open, and staggered into the midst of things with a volley of curses. The room within which they found themselves proved to be the shop of an undertaker, but an open trapdoor in a corner of the floor near the entrance looked down upon a long range of wine cellars, whose depths the occasional sound of bursting bottles proclaimed to be well stored with their appropriate contents. In the middle of the room stood a table, in the center of which again arose a huge tub of what appeared to be punch. Bottles of various wines and cordials, together with jugs, pitchers, and flagons of every shape and quality, were scattered profusely upon the board. Around it, upon coffin trestles, was seated a company of 6. This company I will endeavor to delineate one by one. Fronting the entrance, and elevated a little above his companions, sat a personage who appeared to be the president of the table. His stature was gaunt and tall, and Legs was confounded to behold in him a figure more emaciated than himself. His face was as yellow as saffron, but no feature excepting one alone was sufficiently marked to merit a particular description. This one consisted in a forehead so unusually and hideously lofty as to have the appearance of a bonnet or crown of flesh superadded upon the natural head. His mouth was puckered and dimpled into an expression of ghastly affability, and his eyes, as indeed the eyes of all at the table, were glazed over with the fumes of intoxication. This gentleman was clothed from head to foot in a richly embroidered black silk velvet pall, wrapped negligently around his form after the fashion of a Spanish cloak. His head was stuck full of stable-hearse plumes, which he nodded to and fro with a jaunty and knowing air, and in his right hand he held a huge human thigh-bone, with which he appeared to have been just knocking down some member of the company for a song. Opposite him, and with her back to the door, was a lady of no whit the less extraordinary character. Although quite as tall as the person just described, she had no right to complain of his unnatural emaciation. She was evidently in the last stage of a dropsy, and her figure resembled nearly that of the huge puncheon of October beer, which stood with the head driven in close by her side in a corner of the chamber. Her face was exceedingly round, red, and full, and the same peculiarity, or want of peculiarity, attached itself to her countenance, which I before mentioned in the case of the President's. That is to say, only one feature of her face was sufficiently distinguished to need a separate characterization. Indeed, the acute Tarpaulin immediately observed that the same remark might have applied to each individual person of the party, every one of whom seemed to possess a monopoly of some particular portion of physiognomy. With the lady in question, this portion proved to be the mouth. Commencing at the right ear, it swept with a terrific chasm to the left. The short pendants which she wore in either auricle continually bobbing into the aperture. She made, however, every exertion to keep her mouth closed, and look dignified, in a dress consisting of a newly starched and iron shroud coming up close under her chin, with a crimpled ruff of cambric muslin. At her right hand sat a diminutive young lady whom she appeared to patronize. This delicate little creature, in the trembling of her wasted fingers, in the livid hue of her lips, and in the slight hectic spot which tinged her otherwise leaden complexion, gave evident indications of a galloping consumption. An air of grave extreme hauteur, however, pervaded her whole appearance, and she wore in a graceful and dégaged manner a large and beautiful winding sheet of the finest Indian lawn. Her hair hung in ringlets over her neck, a soft smile played about her mouth, but her nose, extremely long, thin, sinuous, flexible, and pimpled, hung down far below her underlip, and in spite of the delicate manner in which she now and then moved it to one side or the other with her tongue, gave to her countenance a somewhat equivocal expression. Over against her, and upon the left of the dropsical lady, was seated a little puffy, wheezing, and gouty old man, whose cheeks reposed upon the shoulders of their owner, like two huge bladders of Oporto wine. With his arms folded and with one bandaged leg deposited upon the table, he seemed to think himself entitled to some consideration. He evidently prided himself much upon every inch of his personal appearance, but took more especial delight in calling attention to his gaudy-colored surcoat. This, to say the truth, must have cost him no little money, and was made to fit him exceedingly well, being fashioned from one of the curiously embroidered silken covers appertaining to those glorious escutcheons which, in England and elsewhere, are customarily hung up in some conspicuous place upon the dwellings of departed aristocracy. Next to him, and at the right hand of the President, was a gentleman in long white hose and cotton drawers. His frame shook in a ridiculous manner, with a fit of what Tarpaulin called the horrors. His jaws, which had been newly shaved, were tightly tied up by a bandage of muslin, and his arms, being fastened in a similar way at the wrists, prevented him from helping himself too freely to the liquors upon the table, a precaution rendered necessary, in the opinion of Legs, by the peculiarly sottish and wine-bibbing cast of his visage. A pair of prodigious ears, none the less, which it was no doubt found impossible to confine, towered away into the atmosphere of the apartment, and were occasionally pricked up by a spasm at the sound of the drawing of a cork. Fronting him, sixthly and lastly, was situated a singularly stiff-looking personage, who, being afflicted with paralysis, must, to speak seriously, have felt very ill at ease in his unaccommodating habiliments. He was habited, somewhat uniquely, in a new and handsome mahogany coffin, its top or headpiece pressed upon the skull of the wearer, and extended over it in the fashion of a hood, giving the entire face an air of indescribable interest. Armholes had been cut in the sides, for the sake not more of elegance than of convenience, but the dress, nevertheless, prevented its proprietor from sitting as erect as his associates, and as he lay reclining against his trestle, at an angle of 45 degrees, a pair of huge goggle eyes rolled up their awful whites toward the ceiling in absolute amazement at their own enormity. Before each of the party lay a portion of a skull, which was used as a drinking cup. Overhead was suspended a human skeleton by means of a rope tied round one of the legs and fastened to a ring in the ceiling. The other limb, confined by no such fetter, stuck off from the body at right angles, causing the whole loose and rattling frame to dangle and twirl about at the caprice of every occasional puff of wind which found its way into the apartment. In the cranium of this hideous thing lay a quantity of ignited charcoal, which threw a fitful but vivid light over the entire scene, while coffins and other wares appertaining to the shop of an undertaker were piled high up around the room and against the windows, preventing any ray from escaping into the street. At sight of this extraordinary assembly, and of their still more extraordinary paraphernalia, our two seamen did not conduct themselves with that degree of decorum which might have been expected. Legs, leaning against the wall near which he happened to be standing, dropped his lower jaw still lower than usual, and spread open his eyes to their fullest extent, while Hugh Tarpaulin, stooping down so as to bring his nose upon a level with the table, and spreading out a palm upon either knee, burst into a long, loud, and obstreperous roar of very ill-timed and immoderate laughter. Without, however, taking offence at behaviour so excessively rude, the tall president smiled very graciously upon the intruders, nodded to them in a dignified manner with his head of sable plumes, and, arising, took each by an arm, and led him to a seat which some of the others of the company had placed in the meantime for his accommodation. Legs, to all this, offered not the slightest resistance, but sat down as he was directed, while the gallant Hugh, removing his coffle-trestle from its station near the head of the table to the vicinity of the little consumptive lady in the winding-sheet, plumped down by her side in high glee, and pouring out a scull of red wine, quaffed it to the better acquaintance. But at this presumption the stiff gentleman in the coffin seemed exceedingly nettled, and serious consequences might have ensued had not the president, rapping upon the table with his truncheon, diverted the attention of all present to the following speech. "It becomes our duty upon the present happy occasion—" "Avast there," interrupted Legs, looking very serious. "Avast there a bit, I say, and tell us who the devil ye all are, and what business ye have here, rigged off like the foul fiends, and swilling the snug blue ruin stowed away for the winter by my honest shipmate Will Wimble the undertaker." At this unpardonable piece of ill-breeding, all the original company half started to their feet, and uttered the same rapid succession of wild, fiendish shrieks which had before caught the attention of the seamen. The president, however, was the first to recover his composure, and at length, turning to Legs with great dignity, recommenced.
Most willingly will we gratify any reasonable curiosity on the part of guests so illustrious, unbidden though they be. Know then that in these dominions I am monarch, and here rule with undivided empire under the title of King Pest the First. This apartment, which you no doubt profanely suppose to be the shop of Will Wimble the undertaker, a man whom we know not, and whose plebeian appellation has never before this night thwarted our royal ears. This apartment, I say, is the dias chamber of our palace, devoted to the councils of our kingdom, and to other sacred and lofty purposes. The noble lady who sits opposite is Queen Pest, our serene consort. The other exalted personages whom you behold are all of our family, and wear the insignia of the blood royal under the respective titles of His Grace the Archduke Pest Ifris, His Grace the Duke Pest Elenchel, His Grace the Duke Tempest, and Her Serene Highness the Archduchess Anapest. As regards, continued he, your demand of the business upon which we sit here in council, we might be pardoned for replying that it concerns, and concerns alone, our own private and regal interest, and is in no manner important to any other than ourselves. But in consideration of those rights to which as guests and strangers you may feel yourselves entitled, we will furthermore explain that we are here this night, prepared by deep research and accurate investigation to examine, analyze, and thoroughly determine the indefinable spirit, the incomprehensible qualities and nature of those inestimable treasures of the palate, the wines, ales, and liqueurs of this goodly metropolis, by so doing in advance not more our own design than the true welfare of that unearthly sovereign whose reign is over us all, whose dominions are unlimited, and whose name is Death.
"Whose name is Davy Jones," ejaculated Tarpaulin, helping the lady by his side to a skull of liqueur and pouring out a second for himself.
"Profane varlet,"
said the president, now turning his attention to the worthy Hugh.
"Profane and execrable wretch! We have said that in consideration of those rights, which even in thy filthy person we feel no inclination to violate, we have condescended to make reply to thy rude and unseasonable inquiries. We nevertheless, for your unhallowed intrusion upon our counsels, believe it our duty to mulct thee and thy companion in each a gallon of black strap, having imbibed which to the prosperity of our kingdom, at a single draught and upon your bended knees, ye shall forthwith free either to proceed upon your way, or remain and be admitted to the privileges of our table, according to your respective and individual pleasures."
"It would be a matter of utter impossibility," replied Legs, whom the assumptions and dignity of King Pest the First had evidently inspired some feelings of respect, and who arose and steadied himself by the table as he spoke. "It would, please your majesty, be a matter of utter impossibility to stow away in my hold even 1/4 part of the same liquor which your majesty has just mentioned, to say nothing of the stuffs placed on board in the forenoon by way of ballast, and not to mention the various ales and liqueurs shipped this evening at different seaports. I have at present a full cargo of humming stuff taken in and duly paid for at the sign of the Jolly Tar. You will, therefore, please your majesty, be so good as to take the will for the deed, for by no manner of means either can I, nor will I, swallow another drop, least of all a drop of that villainous bilge water that answers to the call of black strap." "Belay that," interrupted Tarpaulin, astonished not more at the length of his companion's speech than at the nature of his refusal. "Belay that, you tubber. And I say, Legs, none of your palaver. My hull is still light, although I confess you yourself seem a little top-heavy. And as for the matter of your share in the cargo, why, rather than raise a squall, I would find stowage room for it myself, but—"
"This proceeding," interposed the President, "is by no means in accordance with the terms of the note or sentence, which is in its nature median, and not to be altered or recalled. The conditions we have imposed must be fulfilled to the letter, and that without a moment's hesitation, in failure of which fulfillment we decree that you do here be tied neck and heels together, and duly drowned as rebels in young hogshead of October beer." "A sentence, a righteous and just sentence, a glorious decree, a most worthy and upright and holy condemnation," shouted the Pest family all together. The king elevated his forehead into innumerable wrinkles. The gouty little old man puffed like a pair of bellows. The lady of the winding sheet waved her nose to and fro. The gentleman in the cotton drawers pricked up his ears. She of the shroud gasped like a dying fish, and he of the coffin looked stiff and rolled up his eyes. Chuckled Tarpaulin without heeding the general excitation.
"I was saying," said he, "I was saying when Mr. King Pest poked in his marlin spiked, that as for the matter of 2 or 3 gallons more or less of black strap, it was a trifle to a tight sea-boat like myself not overstowed. But when it comes to drinking, the health of the devil whom goddess swallows, and going down upon my marrow bones to his ill-favoured majesty there, whom I know as well as I know myself to be a sinner, to be nobody in the whole world but Tim Hurley-Gurley the stage player, why, it's quite another guess sort of a thing, and utterly and altogether past my comprehension." He was not allowed to finish this speech in tranquillity. At the name Tim Hurley-Gurley, the whole assembly leaped from their named seats.
"Treason!"
shouted His Majesty King Pest the First.
"Treason!"
said the little man with gout.
"Treason!"
screamed the Archduchess Anna Pest.
"Treason!"
muttered the gentleman with his jaws tied up.
"Treason!"
growled he of the coffin.
"Treason! Treason!"
shrieked Her Majesty of the Mouth, and seizing by the hinder part of his breeches the unfortunate Tarpaulin, who had just commenced pouring out for himself a scull of liquor, she lifted him high into the air and let him fall without ceremony into the huge open puncheon of his beloved ale. Bobbing up and down for a few seconds like an apple in a bowl of toddy, he, at length, finally disappeared amid the whirlpool of foam, which in the already effervescent liqueur, his struggles easily succeeded in creating. Not tamely, however, did the tall seaman behold the discomfiture of his companion. Jostling King Pest through the open trap, the valiant Legs slammed the door down upon him with an oath, and strode towards the centre of the room. Here, tearing down the skeleton which swung over the table, he laid it about him with so much energy and good-will that, as the last glimpses of light died away within the apartment, he succeeded in knocking out the brains of the little gentleman with gout. Rushing then with all his force against the fatal hogshead full of October ale and Hugh tarpaulin, he rolled it over and over in an instant. Out burst a deluge of liquor so fierce, so impetuous, so overwhelming, that the room was flooded from wall to wall. The loaded table was overturned, the trestles were thrown upon their backs, the tub of punch into the fireplace, and the ladies into hysterics. Piles of death furniture floundered about. Jugs, pitchers, and carboys mingled promiscuously in the melee, and wicker flagons encountered desperately with bottles of junk. The man with the horrors was drowned upon the spot. The little stiff gentleman floated off in his coffin, and the victorious Legs, seizing by the waist the fat lady in the shroud, rushed out with her into the street, and made a bee-line for the free and easy, followed under easy sail by the redoubtable Hugh Tarpaulin, who, having sneezed 3 or 4 times, panted and puffed after him with the Archduchess Pest. End of section 31. Recording by Samantha Gubitz.
Section 32 of The Works of Edgar Allan Poe, RavenEdition Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Works of Edgar Allan Poe, RavenEdition Volume 3 by Edgar Allan Poe. 3 Sundays in a week. You hard-headed, dunder-headed, obstinate, rusty-crusty, musty-fusty old savage, said I, in fancy, one afternoon, to my grand-uncle Rumgudgeon, shaking my fist at him in imagination. Only in imagination. The fact is, some trivial discrepancy did exist, just then, between what I said and what I had not the courage to say, between what I did and what I had half a mind to do. The old porpoise, as I opened the drawing-room door, was sitting with his feet upon the mantelpiece, and a bumper of port in his paw, making strenuous efforts to accomplish the ditty Remplis ton, vere vide ton, vere plain. My dear uncle, said I, closing the door gently, and approaching him with the blandest of smiles, you are always so very kind and considerate, and have evinced your benevolence in so very many ways, that I feel I have only to suggest this little point to you once more to make sure of your full acquiescence. Said he. Good boy. Go on. I am sure, my dearest uncle, you confounded old rascal, that you have no design really, seriously, to oppose my union with Kate. This is merely a joke of yours, I know. Ha, ha, ha! How very pleasant you are at times. Ha, ha, ha! Said he. Curse you, yes. To be sure, of course. I knew you were jesting. Now, uncle, all that Kate and myself wish at present is that you would oblige us with your advice as regards the time, you know, uncle. In short, when will it be most convenient for yourself that the wedding shall come off, you know? Come off, you scoundrel? What do you mean by that? Better wait till it goes on. Ha, ha, ha! Hee, 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 hee! Ha, 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 ha! Ho, 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 ho! Ho, ho, ho! That's good. Oh, that's capital, such a wit. But all we want just now, you know, uncle, is that you would indicate the time precisely.
Ah, precisely?
Yes, uncle. That is, if it would be quite agreeable to yourself.
Wouldn't it answer, Bobby, if I were to leave it at random? Some time within a year or so, for example? Must I say precisely?
If you please, uncle, precisely.
Well then, Bobby, my boy, you're a fine fellow, aren't you? Since you will have the exact time, I'll oblige you for once.
Dear uncle!
Hush, sir, drowning my voice. I'll oblige you for once. You shall have my consent, and the plum. We mustn't forget the plum. Let me see, when shall it be? Tomorrow's Sunday, isn't it? Well, then, you shall be married precisely now, mind, when 3 Sundays come together in a week. Do you hear me, sir? What are you gaping at? I say, you shall have Kate and her plum when 3 Sundays come together in a week, but not till then, you young scrape-case. Not till then, if I die for it. You know me. I'm a man of my word. Now be off.
Here he swallowed his bumper of port, while I rushed from the room in despair. A very fine old English gentleman was my grand-uncle Rumgudgeon, but unlike him of the song, he had his weak points. He was a little, pursy, pompous, passionate, semicircular somebody with a red nose, a thick skull, a long purse, and a strong sense of his own consequence. With the best heart in the world, he contrived, through a predominant whim of contradiction, to earn for himself, among those who only knew him superficially, the character of a curmudgeon. Like many excellent people, he seemed possessed with a spirit of tantalization, which might easily, at a casual glance, have been mistaken for malevolence. To every request a positive "No" was his immediate answer, but in the end, in the long, long end, there were exceedingly few requests which he refused. Against all attacks upon his purse he made the most sturdy defence, but the amount extorted from him, at last, was generally in direct ratio with the length of the siege and the stubbornness of the resistance. In charity no one gave more liberally, or with worse grace. For the fine arts, and especially for the belles lettres, he entertained a profound contempt. With this he had been inspired by Casimir Pereire, whose pert little query, "A quoi un poète est-il bon?" he was in the habit of quoting, with a very droll pronunciation, as the ne plus ultra of logical wit. Thus my own inkling for the Muses had excited his entire displeasure. He assured me one day, when I asked him for a new copy of Horace, that the translation of "Poeta nasciunt non vit" was a nasty poet for nothing fit, a remark which I took in high dudgeon. His repugnance to the humanities had, also, much increased of late, by an accidental bias in favor of what he supposed to be natural science. Somebody had accosted him in the street, mistaking him for no less a personage than Dr. Double-L.D., the lecturer upon quack physics. This set him off at a tangent, and just at the epoch of this story, for story it is getting to be after all, my grand-uncle Rumgudgeon was accessible and pacific only upon points which happened to chime in with the caprioles of the hobby he was writing. For the rest, he laughed with his arms and legs, and his politics were stubborn and easily understood. He thought, with Horsley, that people have nothing to do with the laws but to obey them. I have lived with the old gentleman all my life. My parents, in dying, had bequeathed me to him as a rich legacy. I believe the old villain loved me as his own child, nearly, if not quite, as well as he loved Kate. But it was a dog's existence that he led me, after all. From my first year until my 5th, he obliged me with very regular floggings. From 5 to 15, he threatened me, hourly, with the house of correction. From 15 to 20, not a day passed in which he did not promise to cut me off with a shilling. I was a sad dog, it is true, but then it was a part of my nature, a point of my faith. In Kate, however, I had a firm friend, and I knew it. She was a good girl, and told me very sweetly that I might have her, plum and all, whenever I could badger my grand-uncle Rumgudgeon into the necessary consent. Poor girl! She was barely 15, and without this consent her little amount in the funds was not come-at-able until 5 immeasurable summers had dragged their slow length along. What then to do? At 15, or even at 21, for I had now passed my 5th Olympiad, 5 years in prospect are very much the same as 500. In vain we beseeched the old gentleman with importunities. Here was a piece de la resistance, as Messieurs Unde and Caramet would say, which suited his perverse fancy to a T. It would have stiffed the indignation of Job himself to see how much like an old mouser he behaved to us 2 poor wretched little mice. In his heart he wished for nothing more ardently than our union. He had made up his mind to this all along. In fact, he would have given 10,000 pounds from his own pocket (Kate's plum was her own) if he could have invented anything like an excuse for complying with our very natural wishes. But then we had been so impudent as to broach the subject ourselves. Not to oppose it under such circumstances, I sincerely believe, was not in his power. I have said already that he had his weak points, but speaking of these I must not be understood as referring to his obstinacy, which was one of his strong points. Assurément ce n'était pas so faible. When I mention his weakness, I have allusion to a bizarre old womanish superstition which beset him. He was great in dreams, portents, et id genus omne of rigmarole. He was excessively punctilious, too, upon small points of honor, and, after his own fashion, was a man of his word, beyond doubt. This was, in fact, one of his hobbies. The spirit of his vows he made no scruple of setting at naught, but the letter was a bond inviolable. Now it was this latter peculiarity of his disposition, of which Kate's ingenuity enabled us one fine day, not long after our interview in the dining-room, to take a very unexpected advantage, and having thus, in the fashion of all modern bards and orators, exhausted in Primogenia all the time at my command, and nearly all the room at my disposal, I will sum up in a few words what constitutes the whole pith of the story. It happened then, so the fates ordered it, that among the naval acquaintances of my betrothed were 2 gentlemen who had just set foot upon the shores of England after a year's absence, each in foreign travel. In company with these gentlemen, my cousin and I preconcertedly paid Uncle Rumgudgeon a visit on the afternoon of Sunday, October the 10th, just 3 weeks after the memorable decision which had so cruelly defeated our hopes. For about half an hour the conversation ran upon ordinary topics, but at last we contrived, quite naturally, to give it the following turn. Captain Pratt.
Well, I have been absent just 1 year. Just 1 year to-day as I live. Let me see. Yes, this is October the 10th. You remember, Mr. Rumgudgeon, I called this day year to bid you good-bye. And, by the way, it does seem something like a coincidence, does it not, that our friend Captain Smitherton here has been absent exactly a year also, a year to-day.
Smitherton. Yes, just 1 year to a fraction. You will remember, Mr. Rumgudgeon, that I called with Captain Pratt on this very day, last year, to pay my parting respects.
Uncle.
Yes. I remember it very well. Very queer indeed. Both of you gone just 1 year. A very strange coincidence indeed.
just what Dr. L.D. would denote an extraordinary concurrence of events. Dr. Kate, interrupting.
To be sure, papa, it is something strange. But then Captain Pratt and Captain Smitherton didn't go altogether the same route. And that makes a difference, you know.
Uncle. I don't know any such thing, you hussy. How should I? I think it only makes the matter more remarkable. Dr. L.D.
Kate. Why, papa, Captain Pratt went round Cape Horn, and Captain Smitherton doubled the Cape of Good Hope.
Uncle. Precisely. The one went east and the other went west. You jade, and they both have gone quite round the world. By the by, Dr. L.D.
Myself, hurriedly. Captain Pratt, you must come and spend the evening with us tomorrow. You and Smitherton, you can tell us all about your voyage, and we'll have a game of whist, and... Pratt.
Whist, my dear fellow? You forget. Tomorrow will be Sunday. Some other evening.
Kate. Oh, no, fie! Robert's not quite so bad as that. Today's Sunday.
Pratt. I beg both your pardons, but I can't be so much mistaken. I know tomorrow's Sunday because...
Smitherton, much surprised.
What are you talking about? Wasn't yesterday Sunday, I should like to know?
All.
Yesterday, indeed, you are out.
Uncle.
Today's Sunday. I say, don't I know?
Pratt.
Oh, no! Tomorrow's Sunday!
Smitherton. You are all mad, every one of you. I'm as positive that yesterday was Sunday as I am that I sit upon this chair. Kate, jumping up eagerly. I see it all. Papa, this is a judgment upon you about you know what. Let me alone, and I'll explain it all in a minute. It's a very simple thing indeed. Captain Smitherton says that yesterday was Sunday. So it was. He is right. Cousin Bobby and Uncle and I say that today is Sunday, and so it is. We are right. Captain Pratt maintains that tomorrow will be Sunday. So it will be. He is right, too. The fact is, we are all right, and thus 3 Sundays have come together in a week. Smitherton, after a pause.
By the by, Pratt, Kate has us completely. What fools we two are! Mr. Rumgudgeon, the matter stands thus. The earth, you know, is 24,000 miles in circumference. Now this globe of the earth turns upon its own axis, revolves, spins round, these 24,000 miles of extent, going from west to east in precisely 24 hours. Do you understand, Mr. Rumgudgeon?
Uncle.
To be sure. Dr.
Smitherton, drowning his voice. Well, sir, that is a rate of 1,000 miles per hour. Now, suppose that I sail from this position 1,000 miles east. Of course, I anticipate the rising of the sun here at London by just 1 hour. I see the sun rise 1 hour before you do. Proceeding in the same direction yet another 1,000 miles, I anticipate the rising by 2 hours. Another 1,000, and I anticipate it by 3 hours. And so on, until I go entirely around the globe and back to this spot, when, having gone 24,000 miles east, I anticipate the rising of the London sun by no less than 24 hours. That is to say, I am a day in advance of your time. Understand, eh?
Uncle. But L.D.
Smitherton, speaking very loud. Captain Pratt, on the contrary, when he sailed 1,000 miles west of this position, was an hour, and when he sailed 24,000 miles west, was 24 hours, or 1 day, behind the time at London. Thus, with me, yesterday was Sunday. Thus, with you, today is Sunday. And thus, with Pratt, tomorrow will be Sunday. And what is more, Mr. Rumgudgeon, it is positively clear that we are all right. For there can be no philosophical reason assigned why the idea of one of us should have preference over that of the other. Uncle. My eyes! Well, Kate. Well, Bobby, this is a judgment upon me, as you say. But I am a man of my word, mark that. You shall have her, boy, plum and all, when you please. Done up, by Jove. 3 Sundays all in a row. I'll go and take double L.D.'s opinion upon that. End of section 32. Recording by Todd.